This is the third video in the series Becoming Well Read. In this video I'll be talking about one of the books in my collection, which I've recently reread, in an attempt to become well read. In this video I will be talking about Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King. Now, this book was published in 1999 by one of the most prolific authors of our time, Stephen King. Hey guys, in the last video I read The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Oliver Sacks, and I went over that. So if you haven't seen that video, you might want to go back and check that out if you're interested. But in this video we're going to talk about Stephen King's Hearts in Atlantis. Stephen King is one of my favorite authors. I have like nearly an entire shelf dedicated to his hardcover books. And I've read this book before. This isn't the first time I've read it, but the first time I read it was a while ago. I'd say probably about 8 or 9 years ago, maybe more. And so I read this book with a pretty fresh pair of eyes because, you know, I like when I read to put my own experiences and interpretations on what's going on. This book was written in 5 parts, and each part is sort of a different story because each story doesn't exactly flow together. They flow together chronologically in that the first story is the earliest, but they don't flow together where the same main characters are there throughout. All of the characters in all of the stories appear in the first story, but they are not the main characters of the first story, and so we're just going to go through each story one by one. The first story, Low Men in Yellow Coats, is actually very interesting. It occurred in 1960 when the characters are little kids. And there's this new guy in town called Ted Brodigan, and he's sort of weird. It seems like he's not entirely human. That's what the book wants you to think, that he's not entirely human, and he gives off sort of this strange air about him because he's on the run. He's on the run from these strange men in yellow coats. I don't feel like I fully understood the ending of the first book, because when he gets caught by these low men in yellow coats, they talk about how he's supposed to defend a tower or work on the bridge or something like that. And I think it has something to do with the Dark Tower series, like it's an offshoot to that. But I was still able to enjoy the book. It had a sort of a weird mystery was going on to Ted, like, who was he really? And the main character of the story was actually really close to Ted, and Ted would give him root beer and talk about, you know, the paper, because he hired the kid to read the paper for him, even though he really didn't need the kid to read the paper for him, so that the kid could get money to afford a bike that he wanted. The kid's mom was kind of crazy and overbearing, and Ted was sort of an escape for him, and I liked that part of this book. One of the things I could say about this book is that the family relationship in the main character and his mom seemed real. It seemed like something that would happen. A few things that were strange about the first story is that the signs that the men in yellow coats were around were very strange. There would be like hopscotch marks on the sidewalk, but next to those hopscotch marks were stars and moons and other things and comets, and they would be assigned those things that the low men were close by. Also, another sign was those business cards that were posted upside down, or missing pet posters. They were also signs. And also I think strings, like sort of like kite strings that were hung on some kind of flag poles or some kind of, I don't know, electrical poles. And so those were the signs that the low men were around, and they were looking for Ted because Ted had the power that they needed. And that's basically what the story was about. I'm not going to ruin any of the endings here. The second story, Hearts in Atlantis, and that's actually the title story. And Hearts in Atlantis was very fun to read because it's about these kids who almost flunked out of college during the Vietnam War because of a card game. And that might sound a bit dumb, but a lot of these kids were on scholarships, and they had to maintain a certain GPA to keep their scholarship. And they didn't go to war because they were going to college. And it's sort of that way, like if you could avoid going to the war, being drafted, if you were a college student. And so there was one guy, Ronnie Melonfat, who would start crying out like, "We're hunting the bitch!" And they were playing hearts. And the Queen of Hearts was like a very important card in the game. And so, yeah, it was just really insane. From the first story, Carol, a little girl, was also in this one. And she was one of the college students, although she flunked out about Thanksgiving break of the first semester. And so it was just an interesting read to see like how a card game could sweep people up and how you could sort of lose yourself, your life, in something that's so dumb and trivial. Very interesting to read, I would say. It was one of my favorite. I'd probably say this was the favorite of the 5 stories here for me to read. Hearts in Atlantis relied heavily on things from the Vietnam War. There's so many references to music and to the peace sign and to all sorts of Vietnam War things. There was this one guy on crutches. I forget his name, but he was also like, his character was memorable. I don't remember his name that well, but his character was memorable because he was sort of the loner, the grumpy guy, the guy who had like all the cards stacked against him. And he was the biggest proponent for peace. And somewhere towards the end of the story, he gets really sick and also in a lot of, potentially in a lot of trouble because of something that he did. And the other students who, you know, so caught up in their card game, they go out, they stop their card game to save him because they see that he's going to drown in the heavy rain. And something interesting happens that changes the course of the story for 2 of the students. And so that's that. Third story, Blind Willie, takes place in 1983. The character, Willie, was actually in the first story, and he had actually been one of the 3 boys that had broken Carol's arm in the first story, and he went to the war in Vietnam, and he met Ronnie Melonfant, the card game guy from the second story, and also another one of the main characters from the first story. He had seen him in Vietnam. And the funny thing is that he had taken a glove. And the glove is like an important symbol throughout some of these stories. He had taken a glove from the main character from the first story. It's a baseball glove and it had Bobby's name on it. And he scratched out, he put his own name on it. But this story, Blind Willie, isn't about that. Blind Willie is a story about a man with a wife who goes to work every day and pretends, sort of not really pretends, but becomes blind. Apparently in Vietnam he had lost his sight in a bomb or something like that, and every day as the day becomes brighter he becomes more and more blind. And so he goes from being, I guess, a normal person to a person who is blind, and he has to change his appearance. He has this whole thing where he goes to different places, he gets dressed, he changes his appearance, he puts on the glasses, and he goes outside. And he basically stands at attention, says he's a war vet, which is true, and asks for money, and people give him a lot of money. Actually, I was kind of like unbelieving as to the amount of money the book says that he gained. I don't believe anyone could gain that much money begging for money on the street. But I don't know, St. Patrick's Cathedral, which he stood in front, I think that was a cathedral, is actually a popular place here in New York where a lot of people pass by, so maybe he got that much money. The type of money like in thousands of dollars a day that the book is talking about. And so Blind Willie, it didn't make it clear, the book didn't make it clear enough whether he was really becoming blind at that time or whether it was a fraud, a fake. But during Vietnam, during the bomb, he did become blind temporarily, I guess, and I don't know if it goes away every day or if he pretends it goes away every day. Also, we see Willie struggling with what he did to Carol in the first story, and all these years later, and he writes in the book how sorry he is for what he's done. There's an interesting part about a cop who knows that Willie has a life where he isn't blind, I guess, and he sort of uses to extort money. He uses that to extort money out of Willie, which is kind of insane. The fourth book, Why We're in Vietnam, took place in 1999, And this book is actually kind of strange because there is a death. I guess one of the soldiers dies. And so this book is strange because Carol from the first story, who had a boyfriend between the first story and the second story, her boyfriend is actually in this book, and he was in Vietnam with Ronnie Mellonfent and Willie. And so they're going to a funeral. He is actually going to a funeral from another Vietnam War vet. And he is haunted by someone who was killed, an old Vietnamese woman. They call her Maman. And he is haunted by her image. She's always there. And, you know, they talk about how the Vietnam War vets never left Vietnam. They're still there. Mentally, they're still dealing with stuff from Vietnam. You know, whether it be post-traumatic stress disorder, smoking, drinking, suicide, all these types of real issues. And all these books are works of fiction, by the way, but this is what's happening. And in the end, he dies, the character in this book. But there was a glove, and the glove that was stolen by Willie appears to him at the time of his death. And his death is very strange. He died in a car. I'm not sure if it was a heart attack or a stroke. Something happened to him in a car. But he had a very interesting vision, which I won't go into. And Maman was there. And somehow he got this glove. And that goes right into the next story from 1999. Heavenly Shades of Night Are Falling. In 1999 as well. Where we're going to his funeral. And in his funeral, the two main characters from the first story, Bobby Garfield and Carol, they come together again after a long time of not seeing each other. Apparently Ted, who should be dead, but he's not human, somehow let Bobby know that Carol was going to be there for the death of Sully John. Sully John was the guy's name that Carol had dated. And he let Bobby know because the glove that was Bobby's, that was stolen by Willie, that magically appeared to Sully John at the time of his death, was returned to Bobby Garfield. And it had basically an encrypted message in it. And that's all that is to the last book, just the funeral of Sully John and Bobby and Carol meeting again for the last time. It's a good closure to this book, I think. It lets you know that Ted, again, is superhuman, that things happen sometimes in life that are strange, but it comes around full circle. And so that's Hearts in Atlantis. A summary of the 5 parts. Lots of strange things. If you're interested in Vietnam War, in mental issues, in the Dark Tower series perhaps, read this book. And people becoming obsessed with card games, I would say this is a pretty interesting read. If just for fun, for enjoyment. Nothing really groundbreaking in this book, but still a good getaway, and I'm happy to have reread it. I think I read it at the right time now. I think the first time I read it just to read it, but this time I read it at the right time. It was very interesting. My final thoughts on it, it's not the best Stephen King book. There are a few books I hold in higher regard. Mainly his short stories I like a lot better than these. But it is Stephen King, and I really enjoy his writing. And it was a good getaway, a good foray into fiction, in between all the nonfiction I've been reading recently. And with that, we go to the next book I'm going to be reading. This one was loaned to me by my friend Ernie DeMarie, and it's Hillbilly Elegy. It was given to DeMarie on his birthday. He read it. I said it sounded interesting when he was describing it to me. A lot of my situation in life that I am personally going through, I've seen, well, when he explained it to me, I've seen like parallels. And so I asked if I could read it, and he loaned it to me. And I'm a little bit into it right now. And so, yeah, Hillbilly Elegy is going to be part 4 in the Becoming Well-Read series. So if you like this video, the previous videos, if you want to start a discussion, leave a comment down below. Hit that like button. Please subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and it helps me keep making videos like this. And so, if you haven't picked up Hillbilly Elegy, you know, if you want to pick it up, give it a read. We could read it together, and then we can have a conversation in the comments. I reply to all comments on my videos on books. It helps me keep things fresh in my mind. So comments are always conversation's always ongoing that way. See you next time, guys.